let's begin by seeing how we can summarize data from an Access database. There can be situations where perhaps you will run across an Access database in your organization and you may need to pull data from it, and you may not have a license to use Microsoft Access, or perhaps you have an Access license but you just haven't had time, you haven't been up the learning curve in Access to be able to create reports based on data that is in an Access database. Regardless, whether you have Access on your computer or not, you can use Microsoft Excel to extract data from an Access database, pull it over into Excel, and analyze it with a pivot table. To begin, the first step is we're going to go to the Data menu. Now, the second step is going to depend on how your version of Excel is licensed. If you're using Office 365, step 2 there, you'll have a Get Data command in that first position on your Data menu. And so step 3, you'll choose from Database, and then step 4, you'll choose from Microsoft Access Database. So Office 365 is the very latest version of Excel. It is Excel 2016, but it has enhancements that have been added for folks that are opting to pay for Excel by subscribing. So Microsoft is not forcing us to subscribe to Microsoft Office to use their software, unlike some companies such as Adobe. So if you wish to use any Adobe products, you can no longer just buy a license for Adobe Acrobat, let's say. You have to actually purchase a subscription, and that's how your access to the software is regulated. So rather than enforcing that everyone subscribe, what Microsoft is doing is instead offering sweeteners to folks that are subscribing. And normally in the past, Excel only changed once every 3 years when a new year version came out. If you are subscribing by way of Office 365, then over the course of Excel's 2016's lifespan, Microsoft has added new features that only Office 365 subscribers are privy to, and hence the Get Data command versus what everyone else has, which is a From Access command. So you can still get to data in the same fashion here. It's just going to be, the screen's going to look a little bit different. So if we're using a non-Office 365 version of Excel, we would go to the Data menu, and then we would choose From Access. Once we get to our From Access command, so whether we're clicking on it by way of the Get Data from Database and then from Microsoft Access Database, or just going straight to From Access, step 5 there shows that we will have an Import Data dialog box. From there, we can double-click on the database name that we wish to retrieve the data from. In this case, it's called salesdata.mdb. So let's go to Excel and try these initial techniques out. And so what we're going to do is on our Data menu, I am using Office 365, so that's why for my menu there's a Get Data command here. And so I can come down, I can choose From Database, and then there is my From Microsoft Access Database command. Your command, conversely, may just be in the top corner there in place of Get Data. So wherever it's located, click on the Access command, which in turn brings up an Import Data dialog box. And so here then I'll choose the salesdata.mdb file. So we'll double click on that. And then we're going to be prompted to choose the data that we wish to retrieve. So here again, it's going to look a little different depending on your version of Excel. If you are using the Office 365 version, you will have a navigator screen, and then from there you'll be able to click on a table or query and get a preview of the data. That's new. The older versions of Excel simply will give you a listing of the tables without the opportunity to preview the data. So regardless, you'll click once on the table name, and then most of you that are not using Office 365 won't need to do steps 7 and 8. If you're using Office 365, you'll need to choose the arrow next to Load. Step 8, you'll say Load to. So if you have the navigator screen like we see here, you'll choose Load and then Load to. If you don't, you'll just double click on the table name, and that will then bypass the Import button. So here then we're going to find, because I'm using Office 365, I can click on Sales Data here. I do get to see a preview of the data before I bring it into my spreadsheet. Now, if I were to just click Load directly, what I would end up with is a list, just this raw list in my spreadsheet without summarizing it. The whole point of a pivot table is to be able to summarize this data. So that's why I want to make sure that I don't just click load, because that would just dump this list into my workbook. Instead, I need to click the arrow and then choose load to. In doing so, I will then be presented with a dialog box that we'll see in all versions of Excel. That's going to allow me to choose how do I want to summarize it, or how do I want to view this data. So step 9 there, I'm going to choose pivot table report. That's going to make a pivot table out of the data. Step 10, we'll click OK. So we're then going to see that a blank pivot table canvas will appear on our spreadsheet, and then to the right, the pivot table field list will appear. Now, in the event that you've joined us today, despite the title that says Advanced Pivot Table Techniques, and you don't yet have experience with pivot tables, then pivot tables are going to make sense in a moment, because when we get the data into Excel, I'll then show you how we can create a report from our data. So here is my import data prompt. I'm going to choose pivot table report. I'll then click OK. So what we're going to see on the screen here is our blank pivot table canvas. If you are using Office 365, you will also see this Queries and Connections panel. And you can just simply close that out. In all versions of Excel, what we will see on the right is a pivot table field list. So these are the fields from our Access database. And so in order to create a summary of this data, we can pick and choose fields. So let's say that I choose the state field. When I click on that, state goes down into the rows section, which signals that Excel is going to create a row for every state. So that gives me the ability to create a listing of all the states in my database. Typically, we don't want to see just that listing. We want to see some numbers associated with it. And so that's where I'm going to click on the sales field. Because the sales field is comprised of numbers, Excel places that over in the values section. So now I get to see the sales listed by state. Now, part of why it's called a pivot table is that we can expand the data easily. Let's say that I click on city. Notice then instantly the pivot table expands, and now I get to see the sales broken down by state and then also city. And so if I wanted to, I could then add the company name, or I could remove the company name. And so that's what pivot tables allow us to do, is easily summarize data. And so notice then, as long as we know what data to attach to in a database, meaning that we can identify the table or query that contains the data we're interested in, once we get it over to Excel, then creating a report from it is as simple as clicking checkboxes and perhaps dragging things around on the screen. So for instance, I could take state and drag it into the columns section, create a report that would list all the cities down the side and the states going across. If that doesn't suit me, I can take state, drag it back over here, and then summarize the data again. So with that background on what pivot tables are and what they can do, another thing I want to bring to your attention that can be confusing, notice that when I click in on the pivot table, a set of pivot table tools appear at the top of my Excel screen. So there's an Analyze tab and a Design tab. If you're using an older version of Excel, you instead are going to see tabs that say Options and Design. And so throughout the rest of the presentation today, rather than banding about the terms Options or Analyze to describe that first tab, I'm simply going to refer to it as the first Pivot Table Tools tab. So if I'm carrying out anything that involves this first tab there, I'll just refer to it as the first Pivot Table Tools tab. Another thing that we should be aware of is that presently my cursor is in cell A3. When I take my cursor and move it up to cell A2, then suddenly several things have vanished off the screen. I've lost my field list, and I've lost those Pivot Table Tools headings at the top of the screen. If I move my cursor back within the pivot table, then those commands reappear. However, sometimes I might click the corner of the field list there and close the field list because I might wish to see what's underneath it. And so if I have closed the field list, there is no amount of moving back and forth within the pivot table that's going to bring that back. So if you lose track of your field list, if you right-click on the field list or on the pivot table, then on that right-click menu, you will find a command that says Show Field List. Now, this right-click menu has varying options depending on where you click within the pivot table. Notice if I right-click on a number, I get a more elongated menu there. But regardless, when I do right-click, near the bottom of the right-click menu will be the command that says Show Field List. I click that, brings the field list back. So that's how I interact with my pivot table.